I used to think silence was a gift. In my younger years, I craved it like sugar. After the shrieking of toddlers, the boom of adolescent music, the jabbering of my late husband's television preferences, but silence now feels different. It echoes. It folds around me like an old coat pulled from the attic, once warm, now just musty and heavy. It was a stroke that sent me here. Not a dramatic collapse, mind you, no sirens or flashing lights. Just a sudden forgetting of how to hold a teacup, then a slow tip, the hot liquid soaking my lap and burning my thigh. It was Margaret who found me, my eldest daughter, with her sharp eyes and a voice that could pin a butterfly to the wall. She declared with a quick tap on her phone and a thin-lipped smile that it was no longer safe for me to live alone. "Mom, you're coming with us now, no arguments." So I came, like a parcel wrapped in hospital discharge papers and an insurance summary. They gave me the spare bedroom, once a sewing room, now stripped of color, a beige twin bed, one narrow window, and the lingering scent of printer ink. Tommy, my grandson, made me a welcome sign in crayon. That first night, I smiled and cried quietly, the kind of crying you do when you're too tired to make sound. At first, it felt like safety. Margaret filled my prescriptions, adjusted my pillows, made me tea the way I liked it. Her husband, David, always polite but distant, carried my bags in and never quite looked me in the eye. I told myself they were just busy. But slowly, the air changed. It started with little things. My pension check arriving and Margaret sighing loudly as she sorted the mail. "Do you really want to deal with all that paperwork, Mom? Let me handle the bills. One less thing for you to stress over." And it made sense. I was tired, foggy from the medications, and still afraid my left hand would betray me again. So I nodded, and she took my debit card, just in case. Then came the errands I wasn't consulted on. My knitting supplies went missing. I was told they cluttered the room. My phone plan was changed to a simpler one, and I could no longer call my sister in Oregon without asking for permission. They bought a new smart TV. David smiled as he said, "Thanks to your help, Mom," and laughed. I didn't understand until I noticed my savings account was nearly empty. When I asked, Margaret tilted her head and spoke slowly, like I was a toddler. "Mom, you weren't using that money. We're doing everything for you. Isn't it better to contribute to the family?" I stared at her, and I saw not my daughter, but a stranger with my nose and my father's tight jaw. "Of course," I whispered. "Because that's what you do when your world shrinks to 4 beige walls and you've forgotten how to speak up without trembling." But silence becomes unbearable when it's enforced. One night, I overheard them talking. Their door was cracked open, and the hallway light slanted across the carpet like a blade. "Can't keep paying for her meds, Dave. And she's barely present. You saw how confused she was at dinner. She should sell the old house. We could finally redo the kitchen with that money." My confusion vanished. Like fog lifting over a frozen field, everything sharpened. I wasn't a guest. I was a resource, a calculation. That night, I lay awake and watched the ceiling swirl above me, thinking of my late husband, Harold. He would have been furious. Or maybe he wouldn't. He always believed the girls could do no wrong. But I knew what was happening. And for the first time since the stroke, I felt something solid inside me. Not rage, not sorrow, just a kind of gravity pulling me upright. The next morning, I asked for an outing to the bank. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You sure that's a good idea, Mom? You've been getting so tired lately." I smiled gently. "Let me be tired. I need some air." She couldn't argue with that, not in front of Tommy, who was watching from the stairs. At the bank, I told the manager, an earnest young woman named Beatrice, everything. She listened. She didn't flinch. She offered options, protections. Power of attorney could be reassigned. Accounts could be separated. I didn't need to explain why my voice shook. She simply nodded and began the paperwork. When I got back home, Margaret was on the phone, laughing. She didn't notice I was calmer, that I held my purse a little tighter. I had started something, and I wasn't stopping. The next few days passed like a slow thaw. I kept to my room more, not out of retreat, but to listen, to feel the space breathe again without fear. I could hear them downstairs, clinking dishes and whispering, and I realized how often I had once filled silences with apologies. I apologized when I asked for warm soup, when I changed the thermostat, when I asked to use my own phone. But something had shifted. My apologies had dried up. I was watching them now, listening, not in suspicion, but in clarity. One evening, I asked for my mail. Margaret blinked at me, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Oh, I've already gone through it, Mom. Nothing important." I nodded, lips pressed together like the old Sunday hymn books. "I'd like to go through it myself now." She paused. That long pause she always used when she thought she was being kind, but was really buying time to decide how best to say no. Then she smiled too quickly and handed it over. I took it and returned to my room, sorting through the envelopes like sacred leaves. And there, tucked between an insurance statement and a community newsletter, was a letter from my old neighbor Marcy. She'd scribbled in her uneven cursive, "I miss our porch chats. Your house still looks so lonely. If you're ever visiting, come by. I baked that raisin bread you always liked." I stared at that note for a long time, my fingers tracing the indentations of her writing. It reminded me of who I used to be. Not just the woman recovering from a stroke, but the woman who gave advice over coffee and crocheted blankets for the church drive. The woman whose laughter had once echoed off her own kitchen walls. I had not seen my home in over 8 months. When I asked Margaret if I could visit just to see it, just to check in on what was still in my name, she blinked at me like I'd suggested jumping from a bridge. "Mom, why would you want to do that? It's been empty all this time. It'll just upset you. It's better to let go." Let go. That was the phrase she used like lavender oil. Calming, sweet-scented, meant to soothe while stripping. So I said nothing. But I called a cab the next afternoon, using the little emergency flip phone I kept hidden in the drawer under my socks. I still remember the number to the local taxi company from before the stroke. Some things don't fade. When the car pulled up, the driver, a woman my age with short gray curls and humming jazz on the radio, greeted me with warmth. "Going somewhere special?" "Yes," I said quietly, "home." We drove through streets lined with July's green breath, and as we turned the final corner, I saw it. My house. The windows a little foggy, the grass too long, but still standing. Still mine. I asked her to wait while I walked up to the porch. My legs were unsteady, but not weak. I'd been walking further each morning, circling the garden behind Margaret's house like a determined ghost. The spare key was still behind the porch light. Inside, the air smelled like closed-up time. Dust. Memory. But there were my curtains, my quilt folded over the armchair, my Harold's pipe still on the mantel, and on the kitchen table, a letter from the city about property taxes. I laughed, loud and sharp. The world doesn't pause just because your life folds in half. I sat there for a while, just breathing, just remembering who I had been. I didn't need to stay, not yet. But I needed to know that she, this woman who still lived inside me, had not died. She was here, waiting. When I returned to Margaret's house, no one noticed I'd been gone. They were busy in the living room, arguing about something, money probably. Tommy was on the carpet with his tablet, face pale in the glow of a screen. He looked up at me with soft, questioning eyes. "Where'd you go, Grandma?" "Just out," I said gently. "Just checking on something important." He nodded. Kids know when not to ask more. I sat beside him and watched the animated characters bounce across the screen. But I wasn't really watching. I was planning. The next week, I spoke with Beatrice again. We finalized the financial barriers. I reassigned access, revoked Margaret's card, and began rerouting my pension. Then I called a realtor, quietly, carefully. I asked what it would take to prepare the house for return, not for sale, as Margaret had assumed. For me. I could see her disappointment swelling behind every polite smile. The next morning, I overheard her on the phone again. "And she's being difficult. I don't know what's gotten into her." But I knew. Something had gotten back into me. I was still afraid, but I had a plan. And more than that, I had proof that I could still choose. Sometimes reclaiming yourself begins not with a declaration, but a question. Who was I before this silence? And even deeper, who told me I had to stay? The morning I told Margaret I was leaving was the first time I saw her truly speechless. We were at the kitchen table, her on her phone, me with a mug of tea I'd made myself. I didn't ask for help this time. I'd been slowly reclaiming the small rituals, starting with my tea, then choosing my own clothes, even asking for the laundry schedule instead of letting her pick when and what was washed. I'll be moving back into the house, I said simply, spoon clinking gently against the rim of my cup. Her eyes flicked up from her phone, her lips parted just slightly. What? I've spoken with a contractor. They'll come out next week to check the plumbing and see what needs fixing before I move back in. The air in the room changed. It always does when truth finally enters a space that's lived too long in pretense. Her smile was brittle when it came, thin as glass on the edge of shattering. Mom, you've been through a lot. Don't you think this is impulsive? I watched her hands. They tightened subtly on the phone. That was always the tell with Margaret. Not her face. She could smile through anything, but her hands betrayed her. No, I said softly. I think staying here any longer would be impulsive. I lost myself once already. I won't lose what's left of me. She laughed, short, sharp, defensive. Is this because I didn't tell you about the Netflix account change? Or what, are you mad about the mail again? It's not one thing, I said. It's all the small things that make a person disappear. Her mouth opened again, but I didn't let her speak. For the first time in months, I didn't shrink. I trusted you. I gave you control because I thought you were helping. But I wasn't helped, Margaret. I was managed. And there's a difference. Tommy wandered into the kitchen just then, rubbing his eyes and yawning. He looked at us, sensing something serious, and turned on his heel without a word. Smart boy. Sensitive. I took a breath and stood. I had rehearsed this in my mind dozens of times, each version more fiery than the last, but now that I was here, I only wanted calm. I'm not angry, but I'm not blind anymore either. She didn't argue after that, not directly, but her silence was louder than any shouting could have been. I moved out 2 weeks later. The contractor had aired out the house, replaced a few water pipes, and cleaned the carpets. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. I had lived through imperfection already. Now I wanted truth. The first night back, I stood in the kitchen and ran my fingers along the counter. My old radio sat in the corner, dusty but intact. I turned it on. The dial scratched softly as I turned it, and then there it was. Music. Tinny, familiar, mine. I made myself a sandwich. Simple. Turkey, mustard, a slice of tomato. I cut it into triangles like I used to and ate it in the quiet of my own home. I cried a little, not out of sadness, but out of a strange joy that rose from deep within my ribs, like a bird unfolding its wings after a long winter. The days passed slowly. I had to relearn the rhythm of solitude, of being unmonitored. I burned my first batch of raisin bread. I laughed so hard I had to sit down, the kitchen smelling like toast and cinnamon. I started walking around the block again, waving at old neighbors. Marcy and I sat on my porch with her fresh bread and gossip about the Henderson twins, who were apparently both pregnant now. Lord help them. I changed my phone plan back and called my sister. We talked for an hour and a half. She cried when I told her what had happened. I thought something was wrong, she said. I tried to reach you. Margaret always said you were sleeping. I told her the truth. She listened. She didn't say I told you so. That was the gift of an older sister, compassion before judgment. I didn't cut off Margaret. I didn't feel the need to. I let the distance grow naturally, like pruning a plant that had overgrown its pot. Once or twice she called. Her tone was careful now, almost delicate. How are you managing, Mom? I'm doing just fine, honey. She didn't ask for money again, and I didn't offer. Sometimes Tommy called on his own. He told me about school, about how he missed my Sunday pancakes. I told him he could visit. He did one weekend in September. We baked cookies, and I told him about when his mother was his age, running through sprinklers and hiding in closets during hide and seek. When Margaret came to pick him up, she stood on the porch awkwardly, unsure whether to come in. I stepped outside instead into the sharp autumn air. Thank you, she said suddenly, eyes a little red, for letting him visit. I'm always here for him, I said, then paused. And I'm still your mother. That hasn't changed. But I've remembered who I am too. She nodded, tears welling but not falling. And for a brief second, I saw the little girl in her again, the one who used to bring me dandelions and whisper secrets at bedtime. But I didn't reach out, not yet, maybe someday. For now, I'd come home. Winter settled in quietly that year, brushing my windows with soft frost and turning my lawn to crystal in the morning light. I learned to love the hush that came with snow, how it blanketed even my doubts. It was in those quiet months that I finally began to understand what healing looked like, not as a grand declaration, but as a slow unfolding, like the morning light creeping across the floorboards. My days were filled with small, steady rituals. I knitted again, though my left hand still occasionally betrayed me with tremors. I didn't mind. I learned to laugh at the dropped stitches. I kept the radio on more often, not out of loneliness, but as a reminder that the world was still turning, still humming, still dancing outside my walls. Letters from my sister came regularly now, scrawled in her big, looping handwriting. She promised to visit come spring. Sometimes she included old photographs, one of us in matching Easter hats, another of my wedding day, Harold looking at me like I was a sunrise. I would sit at the kitchen table and run my thumb along those glossy edges, remembering how much of me had lived before all this, before Margaret's house, before the stroke. That knowledge gave me strength. I volunteered once a week at the library, just shelving books and wiping down surfaces, nothing grand. But every Thursday morning, I'd put on my good wool coat, pin the brooch Harold gave me for our 25th anniversary to the lapel, and walk down with my cane tapping steadily against the sidewalk. The librarian, a kind-eyed man in his 40s named Glenn, always had a cup of peppermint tea waiting. We didn't talk much, but I liked the way he treated me, not as fragile or broken, but simply as a woman who liked books. One Thursday, as I was straightening a display of memoirs, I overheard two teenagers whispering nearby. "She's like really old," one giggled. "Probably doesn't even know what TikTok is." I smiled quietly and turned around. "You're right," I said. "But I do know what it's like to fall in love during a war. I know what it's like to bury a husband and to bring a child into the world with no money and only hope. I've lived longer than your entire family tree combined, most likely. So no, I don't know TikTok, but I've earned that ignorance." Their eyes widened like saucers. Then they blushed and murmured apologies before shuffling off. It wasn't anger I'd spoken with. It was truth. The kind that comes from surviving things that don't get mentioned in polite conversation. And in that moment, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't invisible anymore, not to myself. Later that month, I attended a town council meeting. I didn't speak, just observed, but it felt good to be in a room where decisions were made. The mayor, a petite woman with a fierce voice, reminded me a bit of myself at 45. Afterward, she nodded to me in the hall. "Glad to see new faces." "I'm not new," I replied, "just back." That weekend, I received a letter from Margaret. Not a text, not an email, a real letter. Inside was a photo of Tommy, bundled in a scarf I'd knitted last year, grinning beside a snowman. She wrote, "Mom, I don't know how to say this, but I've been thinking a lot about everything. I realize now how much I took for granted. Your trust, your silence, your presence. I thought I was helping, but maybe I was helping myself feel in control more than helping you. I'm sorry, truly. If you're open to it, I'd like to visit. Not to fix anything, just to sit. Love, Margaret." I read it 3 times. My first feeling wasn't anger or relief, it was surprise. That she'd managed to put truth on paper. That she'd used her own voice for once instead of the clipped, polished tone she wore like a business suit. I didn't rush to respond. Instead, I sat by the window holding the photograph. Snow fell lightly, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't dread what came next. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. "Dear Margaret, thank you for your honesty. You're welcome to visit. We'll have tea. Let's just be people this time. No roles, no debts. Love, Mom." And I meant it because liberation, I had learned, doesn't always mean burning bridges. Sometimes it means building a new one, sturdier and less traveled, just wide enough for peace to pass through. Weeks later, she came, not with a suitcase of plans or a folder of papers, but with a pie she baked herself. We sat in the kitchen, my kitchen, and talked like old friends who had survived something unspeakable and were now trying to name it. There was no big apology, no dramatic reconciliation, but there was warmth, there was honesty, And when she left, I didn't feel hollow, I felt full. I watched her car drive off down the street, then turned back inside, closing the door gently behind me. The house held its breath, then exhaled. And I stood there, not as a mother or a widow or a woman recovering from a stroke, but as myself, still standing, still whole, still home.